Picture a beach. It is a gray, perfectly ordinary morning in the north of England.
Yeah, just a typical chilly English morning.
Right. The year is 793, and on this specific stretch of coastline, you have this small tidal island called Lindisfarne.
Right.
And, if you are standing there looking around, you are basically looking at the holiest community in all of northern Britain.
Absolutely. It was the epicenter of Christian scholarship there.
Yeah, so you have monks going about their daily routines. They are praying in the chill morning air. They are quietly and meticulously copying out these sacred manuscripts in the scriptorium.
Illuminating the vellum with crushed lapis lazuli and gold leaf.
Exactly. Some are outside tending to the monastery's garden, just wrapped in heavy wool against that biting wind coming off the North Sea. It is a scene of absolute, unbroken, deeply repetitive peace.
Until it isn't.
Right, until it isn't. Because then you look out at the horizon, and there is a disruption. You see ships, but not just any ships.
No, definitely not merchant vessels.
Right. These are long, low, incredibly sleek vessels, and they are moving across the water with a terrifying, almost impossible speed.
They practically glide.
Yeah. And at the front of these ships, curling up into the gray sky, are these carved prows shaped like the necks of serpents, with their eyes glaring down at the surf, and the men who are about to climb out of those ships onto the sand.
Well, they're about to permanently alter European history.
Violently and permanently.
It is an incredibly visceral image. I mean, the sheer shock of it is what resonates so deeply through the historical record.
Oh, for sure.
The suddenness of those serpent ships arriving on that quiet beach wasn't just, a military event. It was the catastrophic collision of two entirely different paradigms.
Right.
You have this isolated ascetic Christian community built on the premise of spiritual retreat, suddenly face-to-face with a hypermobile martial culture operating under an entirely different set of rules.
Well, welcome to this deep dive, everyone. That specific feeling I just described, that sudden, chaotic arrival of violence and speed, is exactly how we have been conditioned to view these seafaring warriors.
Yeah, it's the classic Hollywood entrance.
Right. If you watch the opening of a show like Vikings or read almost any pop history thriller, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is pure adrenaline.
It really is.
You have absolutely no idea who these people are. You have no idea where they came from. They are presented as this unstoppable, almost alien force of nature crashing onto the screen, swinging axes, completely devoid of context.
They are basically presented as a natural disaster,
Mm-hmm.
like a hurricane or an earthquake just washing over the land.
Exactly.
And that framing does a massive disservice to the actual history. The popular conception we have inherited is essentially a caricature. It's a composite sketch drawn by their enemies and heavily embellished by Victorian romantics centuries later.
Which is exactly why we are dismantling that image today. We are going to peel back the layers of Victorian fantasy, the Hollywood exaggerations, and, frankly, the centuries of linguistic misunderstandings.
There are quite a few of those.
So many. We are going to strip all of that away to answer one fundamental question for you. Who were these people, actually?
I think by the time we finish exploring this, you will understand that those supposed monsters stepping onto the beach at Lindisfarne were anything but mindless savages.
Right.
They were driven by an incredibly complex set of socioeconomic pressures at home. They were wielding genuinely groundbreaking, sophisticated maritime technology.
Oh, the boats are amazing.
They really are. And perhaps most surprisingly for anyone raised on the pop culture myth, they were operating under a deeply intricate, almost poetic, philosophical view of life, law, and legacy.
It's so much more than just a smash and grab raid.
Profoundly richer. Yes.
So let's start by dismantling the foundation of the myth, which is the very name we use to describe them. I want to look at the word Viking, because if you are listening to this right now, you probably think of that word as an ethnic identifier.
Most people do.
Right. We use it exactly the same way we would say the Romans, the Greeks, or the Aztecs. But historically, linguistically, that categorization is a complete failure, isn't it?
It is the foundational misunderstanding that colors almost every conversation about this era. Viking was never an ethnic group.
Right.
It wasn't a nationality, and it certainly wasn't a bloodline. In the Old Norse language, the phrase fara I viking was a verb phrase.
A verb.
Exactly, to describe an action. It specifically meant to go on an expedition by sea, typically for the purpose of raiding, trading, or exploring. A Viking was just a person who was currently performing that specific activity. It was literally a job title.
Okay, so it is a description of an activity. Calling all medieval Scandinavians Vikings is basically the equivalent of calling all modern Americans astronauts, just because a very specific, highly trained subset of them occasionally put on suits and go to space.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. I mean, imagine historians 1,000 years from now finding a piece of a NASA shuttle and retroactively assuming every single person living in North America in the 21st century spent their days orbiting the Earth in zero gravity.
That would be absurd.
Right. It's a massive error in categorization. Being a Viking was a temporary, often seasonal occupation. It was not an entire all-encompassing cultural identity.
And when you look at the reality of their daily lives,
Yeah.
it is aggressively mundane compared to the myth.
So mundane.
Right. The vast, overwhelming majority of Norse people in the 8th and 9th centuries never went Viking at all. They were agrarian.
The her farmers.
Yeah, farmers who stayed home, raised sheep, grew barley, and made cheese. They lived and died without ever setting foot on one of those terrifying raiding ships.
The men who sailed to Lindisfarne, the ones who violently inserted themselves into the historical record in 793, they were a distinct minority.
Just a fraction of the population.
Exactly. They were a specific demographic subset, mostly young, highly ambitious men who, as we will explore in a moment, had very specific, highly rational socioeconomic reasons to be out on the water trying to secure portable wealth.
It is so fascinating to look at how that temporary job functioned, too. Like, you plant your crops in the spring, you go Viking during the summer months when the seas are navigable and the weather is favorable, and then...
I sail back home in time for the autumn harvest.
Right. It was a seasonal double life. You were a farmer in May, a raider in July, and a farmer again by October.
Which naturally begs the question, if a Viking is just a seasonal job description for a small percentage of the population, what is the historically accurate term for the wider culture?
Right. What do we call them?
The most useful umbrella term, the one that encompasses the cheesemakers, the blacksmiths, and the raiders alike, is Norse, or Norseman. It translates simply to the people of the North.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the complexity doesn't stop there. The rest of the medieval world didn't have a unified name for them either.
No, they definitely didn't.
Depending on where a Norse ship landed, the people on the beach called them something completely different.
Exactly. And those contemporary names reveal a lot about the geopolitics of the era. I mean, if you look at the Frankish Empire, the massive superpower controlling modern-day France and Germany, they referred to these raiders broadly as Northmen.
Which makes perfect geographical sense from their vantage point. They came from the north.
It does. But then you cross the channel to the Anglo-Saxons in England. The English chroniclers tended to call all of these maritime raiders Danes.
Even if they weren't from Denmark.
Completely. Regardless of whether they actually originated from Denmark, Norway, or anywhere else in Scandinavia, to an Anglo-Saxon king, if you arrived on a long ship, carried a broad axe, and spoke Old Norse, you were Dane. It was just a blanket term for the threat.
Wow. And my personal favorite linguistic twist happens when you look to the east.
Oh, the river routes.
Yeah. When the Slavic and Byzantine peoples encountered Norsemen navigating the vast river systems of Eastern Europe, they didn't call them Northmen or Danes. They called them the Rus.
The etymology of Rus is endlessly fascinating. It likely derives from an Old Norse term for the men who row.
The men who row.
Yeah. These were primarily Swedish Norsemen who established massive trade networks down the Dnieper and Volga rivers. And over generations of settling, intermarrying, and dominating the local Slavic populations, they established a federation known as the Kievanos.
Wait, meaning the very word Russia, the name of the largest modern nation on Earth, is a direct linguistic descendant of the name given to Swedish Norsemen rowing down rivers in the 9th century.
It absolutely is. It perfectly illustrates how deeply entrenched the Norse became in the world they explored.
Right.
So we have Northmen, Danes, and Rus.
And the fact that we have consolidated all of this incredible, sprawling diversity under the single misunderstood verb Viking is a testament to how sloppy our historical memory can be.
Sloppy is a great word for it. It really erases the nuance.
So if they weren't this singular, unified Viking nation, we have to look at how their world was actually structured, because Scandinavia at this time was not a single political entity with a king sitting in a central capital.
Not at all.
It was a massive, rugged expanse of land divided into 3 broad, distinct regions that roughly correspond to the modern borders of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. And the physical geography of those 3 homelands essentially dictated the entire trajectory of their history.
Geography is absolutely destiny when you're studying the Norse.
Right.
The landscape forced their hand, dictating where they could go and who they would encounter. Let's look at Norway first.
Okay, the explorers.
Right. Norway's geography is defined by an incredibly long, punishing, jagged coastline on the western edge of the Scandinavian peninsula. It is a landscape dominated by deep plunging fjords, massive mountains, and a severe, critical lack of viable, flat farmland.
I mean, it's stunningly beautiful to look at, but if you are trying to feed a family with a wooden plow in the 8th century, it is a nightmare.
Precisely. You cannot plant barley on a sheer rock face. So if you are a Norwegian youth seeking wealth or arable land, you only have one option. You look the ocean in front of you.
You have to go out.
The Norwegians were forced by their geography to point their ships west and north out into the teeth of the North Atlantic. They became the great unparalleled deep ocean explorers of the era.
They were the ones finding the empty places on the map.
Exactly. They were the ones who navigated the treacherous waters to Scotland, to the Orkney and Shetland Islands, to Ireland. They pushed into the true unknown.
And eventually Iceland.
Yes. The Norwegians settled Iceland. And from Iceland, they pushed further west to colonize the edge of Greenland. And ultimately, it was this Norwegian trajectory that led Leif Erikson to cross the Atlantic entirely and establish a temporary settlement in North America.
Right, at Lenso Meadows in Newfoundland.
Yes, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. Their geography demanded that they become deep-sea navigators.
Now, contrast that with Denmark. You look at a map, and Denmark sits right at the bottom of Scandinavia. It is essentially a peninsula and a smattering of islands acting as a geographic gateway.
A bridge between the harsh, isolated north and the established, incredibly wealthy continental Europe.
Yeah, that position changed everything for the Danes. I mean, they had flat, fertile land, which allowed for a larger, more densely concentrated population.
And more importantly, they weren't staring out at the empty expanse of the North Atlantic.
Right, they were looking right across the border at the wealthy Carolingian Empire of the Franks. And just a short hop across the North Sea lay the rich, divided kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England.
They were basically sitting right next door to the medieval equivalent of Beverly Hills.
The medieval Beverly Hills, exactly.
Right. Because of their proximity to all that established wealth and political infrastructure, the Danes pointed their ships south and west. They didn't need to be explorers of the unknown. They were the heavy-hitting conquerors of the known world.
So when we read about the massive invasions...
Yes, when you read the Anglo-Saxon chronicles detailing massive organized fleets, what they call the Great Heathen Army, systematically taking over huge chunks of Britain, you are almost entirely reading about the Danes.
Okay, so we have the Norwegians as the deep-sea explorers of the West, the Danes as the massive organized conquerors of the South, and then we have Sweden.
Sweden is fascinating because its geography faces the exact opposite direction. Sweden looks east, out over the comparatively calm waters of the Baltic Sea.
So they didn't even bother with the Atlantic.
No, the Swedes didn't bother sailing into the fierce Atlantic. They pointed east, crossed the Baltic, and became arguably the greatest river navigators of the medieval world.
Their journey is staggering. I mean, they didn't just cross the sea and stop at the coastline. They pushed incredibly deep into the continental landmass of Eastern Europe.
They navigated the massive, sprawling river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. And here's a crazy part. When a river became unnavigable, or when they needed to jump from one river system to another, they would physically drag their massive oak ships across the land.
Wait, drag the ships?
Yes, a process called portaging. They would drag these massive ships over the land until they hit the next waterway. They followed these rivers all the way south until they spilled out into the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea.
So by doing that, they bypassed the entirety of Western Europe and connected the deep, freezing pine forests of Scandinavia directly to the great economic and cultural superpowers of the East.
Exactly, the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate.
And the wealth they encountered there dwarfed anything in England or France.
Oh, without a doubt. The Swedes established massive trade emporiums. They were trading northern commodities like furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slave people for staggering amounts of Abbasid silver dirhams and Byzantine silk.
It's wild to think about. And some of these Swedish Norsemen, these Rus, were so highly regarded for their martial prowess that they actually ended up serving as the elite personal bodyguards for the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople.
The famous Varangian Guard.
The Varangian Guard. Let that image sink in for a moment. You have men born in the freezing dark winters of Sweden standing guard in the most opulent, wealthy, politically complex palace in the Mediterranean world, carrying their massive, broad axes through halls of marble and gold.
It is one of the most incredible cultural crossovers in human history, and it perfectly illustrates the geographical point we were making. You have three distinct regions pointing their ships in three totally different directions, interacting with entirely different empires, climates, and economies.
Okay, I have to challenge this setup, though.
Go for it.
If you have these three groups, the Norwegians sailing into the frozen Atlantic to hunt walrus, the Danes organizing massive armies to tax the English, and the Swedes sailing down the Dnieper River to trade with Islamic scholars in Baghdad, did they even view themselves as a shared culture?
That's a very fair question.
I mean, are we just lazily lumping them together because they all happen to live near each other and used similar boats?
It is a vital question, but they were absolutely united by a profound, unshakable cultural bedrock. Despite the thousands of miles separating their outward journeys, their internal world was the same.
Really? How so?
First and foremost, they were united by language. Old Norse was a mutually intelligible language across all of Scandinavia and its colonies. A Norwegian trader in Dublin could sit down with a Swedish mercenary returning from Constantinople, and they could converse perfectly.
Wow. So they could share the same stories, the same poetry.
Exactly. They also shared a common religious framework, the complex pantheon of Odin, Thor, Freya, and the underlying fatalistic mythology of Ragnarok. They shared remarkably similar legal concepts regarding honor, compensation, and assembly. And crucially, they shared the exact same maritime engineering principles.
The longships.
Yes. So while their daily lives and external enemies varied wildly, if you put them in a longhouse together, they would implicitly recognize each other as belonging to the same cultural universe. They were distinct branches of the exact same tree.
Okay, so having mapped out this world, we know who they were mostly farmers, and we know exactly how their geography dictated their movements. We arrive at the massive historical mystery of this era.
The catalyst.
Yes, they had inhabited Scandinavia for thousands of years, they had axes, they knew how to sail, and they knew how to fight. Why did the Viking Age, this massive, explosive, outward expansion of violence, trade, and settlement, suddenly ignite in the late 8th century?
Right, why then?
Why did the raid on Lindisfarne happen in 793 and not 100 years earlier or later?
Historians and archaeologists have debated the precise catalyst for the Viking Age for over a century. There's no single, simple smoking gun.
It's never just one thing, is it?
Never. What the historical record reveals is a convergence of several massive, disparate forces. It was a perfect historical storm where socio-economic pressures at home, leaps in technological engineering, and a highly specific geopolitical vacuum abroad all aligned at the exact same moment.
Let's examine the socioeconomic pressure first, specifically the brutal reality of land ownership and the crisis of the younger sons. We touched on how scarce arable land was in places like Norway.
Yes,
But the tension wasn't just geographical, right? It was hard-coded into their inheritance laws.
absolutely. In many Norse communities, property and power were heavily concentrated. They practiced forms of inheritance that heavily favored the eldest son.
So the oldest takes all.
Pretty much. When a patriarch died, the farm wasn't equally divided among his 5 children, because dividing an already marginal farm in a harsh climate meant all 5 children would likely starve. The estate had to stay intact to remain economically viable.
Which makes perfect sense from an agricultural standpoint, but it creates a massive sociological time bomb.
Huge one.
If you are the second, third, or fourth son in a Norse family, you are legally and geographically locked out of the primary economy. You have no land coming your way. You have no inheritance.
You essentially have no future in your own homeland. You are young, you are ambitious, you want to marry, you want to establish a household, but you have zero prospects. You are a disenfranchised demographic with nothing to lose.
That is a dangerous demographic.
Very. Furthermore, Norse society was highly competitive. Chieftains, the Hifsingi, maintained their power not through standing armies, but through their ability to generously reward their followers with wealth.
So they needed a constant flow of cash.
Exactly. If a chieftain wanted to keep his men loyal, he needed a constant influx of silver, weapons, and status symbols to distribute.
So you have a top-down pressure where chieftains desperately need new wealth to maintain political power, and a bottom-up pressure where landless younger sons desperately need an avenue for social mobility.
Perfect storm.
Raiding wasn't just a fun summer adventure. It was a desperately needed path to wealth and status for an entire generation of men who had absolutely nothing waiting for them at home. The entire outward expansion functioned as a violent population pressure valve for Scandinavia.
But as you pointed out earlier, desperation and ambition alone do not alter history.
Yeah.
You can be as desperate as you want, but you cannot swim from Bergen to the coast of England holding a sword in your teeth.
No, you definitely could not.
This brings us to the technological catalyst, the undisputed engine of the Viking Age, the longship.
Ah, the longship. I love this part. The engineering behind the longship is truly one of the great leaps in human technology. It wasn't just a boat, it was a maritime superweapon that completely redefined the geometry of warfare and trade.
It really was a superweapon. No other culture in Europe possessed anything that could remotely compete with it at the time.
So how did it work? Because it wasn't built like Roman or English ships.
Right. The Norse developed a highly specific method of ship construction known as lapstrake, or clinker built. Unlike Mediterranean shipbuilders who would first build a rigid, heavy internal skeleton of ribs and then nail thick planks flush against each other, the Norse built the outer shell of the ship first.
Outside in.
Yes. They used incredibly long, thin planks of oak, radially split along the natural grain of the wood rather than sawn.
Which is a crucial distinction, splitting instead of sawing. Splitting the wood along the grain makes the plank incredibly strong but remarkably flexible.
Precisely. They would overlap these thin planks, like the siding on a house, and rivet them together with iron. Then they would lash a light, flexible internal frame to the inside.
So it wasn't stiff.
Not at all. The result was a ship that didn't rigidly smash its way through the ocean waves like a battering ram. Instead, a longship was designed to flex, bend, and undulate, literally riding over the crests of the brutal North Atlantic swells.
That is wild. It's the difference between driving a heavy, rigid truck and a highly tuned sports car with incredible suspension.
Great analogy.
But the true tactical genius of the longship was its symmetry and its draft.
Yes. A massive longship, capable of carrying 60 to 100 armed men, fully loaded with provisions and cargo, might only sit 3 feet deep in the water.
3 feet, that is nothing for a ship of that size.
Barely waist deep. That shallow draft gave them unprecedented dual functionality. They could survive the deep, terrifying expanses of the open ocean, but upon reaching a coastline, they didn't have to stop.
Because they could go inland.
Exactly. Because the ship sat so high in the water, they could sail right up shallow, winding inland rivers deep into the absolute heart of a country. The Frankish kings might set up defenses on the coast, but suddenly a fleet of Norse ships is navigating a river hundreds of miles inland, dropping anchor right outside Paris.
And because of that shallow keel, they completely eliminated the need for infrastructure.
That's the key.
Right, because a traditional European merchant or military ship requires a deep water port. It needs a stone dock, a harbor, cranes, and a massive logistical setup just to land and unload. The Norse bypassed all of that. They could row right up to any gently sloping sandy beach in Europe, slide the keel directly onto the sand, and 60 armed men could be out of the boat and sprinting toward a town in seconds.
It granted them the ultimate tactical advantage. Absolute terrifying surprise. They could appear anywhere there was water, strike with devastating speed, and push their ships back off the sand and disappear before the local lords could even mobilize a militia.
Just impossible to defend against.
Exactly. The raids across Europe were physically impossible without this single specific piece of technology. The longship was the vehicle that made the ambition of those desperate younger sons a reality.
So we have the desperate men and we have the technological marvel that can transport them. The third element that ignited the Viking Age was the geopolitical landscape they encountered when they stepped off those ships.
The target.
Exactly. They needed a target. And late 8th century Christian Europe provided an almost comical abundance of undefended, concentrated wealth.
To understand the sheer shock of Lindisfarne, you have to understand how Christian Europe had organized itself.
Right.
The landscape was dotted with monasteries and abbeys. These were not simply places of quiet prayer. They were effectively the cultural, artistic, and economic treasuries of the region. They were packed with immense wealth.
We're talking solid gold crucifixes, silver chalices.
Reliquaries studded with gemstones, incredibly valuable illuminated manuscripts bound in precious metals. Enormous concentrations of portable wealth.
And because of the aesthetic nature of monasticism, these places were often deliberately built in highly isolated locations.
They sought isolation for spiritual contemplation. They built on lonely, windswept coastlines or small tidal islands exactly like Lindisfarne. They wanted to be far away from the corruption and noise of the secular world.
Which makes sense spiritually.
But tactically, that exact spiritual isolation meant they were completely cut off from any military defense. They were entirely unprotected, populated exclusively by men who had taken strict vows of nonviolence.
We really have to look at this culture clash from the Norse perspective. To the Christian world, a monastery is a profoundly sacred, untouchable site. Attacking it is an offense against God himself.
Right, the invisible shield of religious awe was supposed to protect them.
But what happens when a Norse raider who worships Odin and Thor looks at that same building?
What's fascinating here is that the invisible shield completely evaporates. To a Norse raider, a Christian monastery holds absolutely zero spiritual significance.
Nothing.
They do not fear the Christian God, and they certainly don't respect vows of poverty. What they see is entirely practical.
It is an unlocked bank vault.
Exactly. It is an unlocked bank vault, stuffed with precious metals, surrounded entirely by men who refuse to fight back, situated conveniently right next to the water where their ships are parked.
It is the ultimate asymmetrical opportunity.
When the Norse sacked Lindisfarne, the surviving Christian scholars, like Alcuin of York, recorded the event in terms of apocalyptic sacrilege. They literally wrote about it as if the end of days had arrived, describing dragons flying in the sky and the wrath of God falling upon them for their sins.
But to the Norse raiders,
They didn't view themselves as demonic agents of the apocalypse. They simply saw an undefended treasury. They loaded the silver onto their ships, pushed off the beach, and considered it a highly efficient, incredibly profitable day's work.
wow. So when you stack these elements, a massive demographic of landless younger sons needing wealth for social mobility, handing them a shallow draft maritime superweapon, and pointing them toward a continent full of isolated, undefended gold, the sudden explosion of the Viking Age isn't a mystery at all.
Not at all.
It is a highly rational, almost inevitable historical outcome.
It replaces the narrative of mindless barbarian violence with a narrative of brutal, opportunistic logic.
And speaking of that barbarian narrative, now that we understand the actual mechanics of why they expanded, we need to do some serious demolition work on the pop culture caricature.
My favorite part.
We have to actively destroy the Victorian myths that still completely cloud the public's judgment of these people.
This is perhaps the most necessary part of understanding the Norse. The dominant image we hold in our collective imagination is an utter fabrication, assembled piecemeal, centuries after the Viking Age ended.
Okay, let's start by gleefully shattering the most ubiquitous symbol of them all, the horn helmet.
Oh, the horned helmet.
I know it's on sports logos. I know it looks incredibly intimidating in cartoons and comic books. But there is absolutely zero archaeological evidence that any Norse raider ever wore a horn helmet into battle. It did not happen.
It is a complete fiction. If you look at the archaeological record, the graves, the bog finds, the contemporary carvings, when the Norse wore helmets, which was actually quite rare because iron was incredibly expensive, they were simple, functional, rounded iron caps.
Just a smooth dome.
Exactly. A wealthy warrior might have a spectacle helmet, featuring a metal guard that came down over the eyes and nose for extra facial protection, like the famous find at Jomundbu in Norway. But that was the extent of it. Smooth, rounded, and entirely functional.
Because if you pause for 10 seconds and think about the actual mechanics of medieval hand-to-hand combat, bolting two massive cow horns to your head is an incredibly stupid idea.
It would be actively lethal to the person wearing it. Norse combat heavily relied on the shield wall, the skjoldborg. You were standing shoulder to shoulder with your allies in a tight, compressed formation, overlapping your wooden shields.
Right.
If you have a foot of horn sticking out of either side of your head, you are going to blind or stab the man standing next to you every time you turn your head.
Not to mention what the enemy would do with them.
Exactly. In the chaos of melee combat, a horn is nothing but a convenient handle for your enemy to grab onto. Or worse, a glancing blow from an enemy's broadsword or axe, which would normally slide off a smooth, rounded helmet, would catch solidly on the horn, violently snapping your neck. Yeah, no veteran warrior would ever wear such a massive liability into a fight.
So if the Norse never wore them, how did this image become so deeply embedded in our culture?
We have to fast forward 1,000 years.
To the 1800s. It stems entirely from the Romantic era in Europe, specifically from the world of theatrical costume design.
Yes, we can trace the popularization of the horned helmet almost entirely to the 1876 premiere of Richard Wagner's massive opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen.
Wagner.
Right. The costume designer, Karl Emil Dobler, wanted the ancient Germanic and Norse characters to look more primal, ancient, and imposing on stage. So, drawing loose inspiration from some Bronze Age ritual helmets that had absolutely nothing to do with the Viking Age, he added massive horns to the singers' costumes.
That is just wild. The ultimate icon of Viking ferocity is literally a 19th century theater costume.
It is.
It is incredible how a single artistic choice made for an opera stage completely overwrote historical reality for the next 150 years.
It is a powerful testament to the influence of media. Fortunately, modern representations are slowly correcting this.
Thank goodness. Okay, let's tackle the next massive misconception. The idea that the Norse were filthy, unwashed, matted, mud-caked savages. We always see them depicted on screen, covered in dirt, looking like they haven't seen a bar of soap in a decade.
This myth is actually the exact inverse of the truth. By the standards of medieval Europe, the Norse were remarkably, almost obsessively clean.
Really, obsessively.
Yes. We have an overwhelming amount of physical evidence from archaeological excavations of Norse settlements. In almost every grave or longhouse site, archaeologists uncover personal grooming kits.
Grooming kits.
They find intricately carved bone and antler combs, they find fine tweezers, they find razors, and they find teeny, delicate spoons, specifically designed for cleaning out earwax.
They were essentially running medieval day spas.
Basically, they were highly concerned with personal maintenance.
And we don't just have the physical artifacts. We have written confirmation of this from the very people who hated them. There is a deeply amusing historical account written by an English cleric, John of Wallingford, writing about the Danish men who had settled in England.
Oh, I love this one.
Right? He is writing a chronicle, but he takes the time to complain, very irritably, about the hygiene habits of the Norse. You would think a monk whose country is being invaded would complain about the violence or the theft. What is his specific grievance?
His grievance is that the Danes are too clean.
Too clean.
He specifically records that the Danish men combed their hair every single day, they insisted on changing their clothes regularly, and they had the audacious habit of bathing once a week.
Which is actually hard-coded into their modern language.
Yeah.
Saturday in Old Norse and in modern Scandinavian languages like Icelandic is lagerdag, which translates literally to washing day or pool day.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And John of Wallingford's ultimate complaint wasn't just theological annoyance over their bathing. He was genuinely furious because the Danish men were so well-groomed, clean, and attractive that they were supposedly stealing all the noble English women.
That is hilarious.
The local women clearly preferred the well-groomed, pleasant-smelling Norsemen over the local men who bathed far less frequently.
So the terrifying Viking raiders were actually stealing hearts through superior conditioning and regular exfoliation.
Basically.
It completely ruins the grim, muddy aesthetic, but it instantly humanizes them. They cared deeply about their appearance and how they presented themselves to the world.
Which perfectly segues into the most damaging myth of all, the myth of the disorganized, mindless barbarian rabble. The idea that they were just brutes who only understood violence.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the contrast between their outward violence on raids and their internal cultural sophistication is staggering. We are talking about a society that prized intellectual and artistic pursuits as highly as martial prowess. Take their poetry, for example. Skaldic poetry wasn't just simple rhyming couplets.
Oh, not at all. Skaldic poetry, specifically the Drakfavit meter, is one of the most intricately complex poetic forms ever devised in any language.
Explain how it works.
Well, it required a strict counting of syllables, internal rhymes, alliteration, and the use of kennings, which are complex multi-word metaphors. A poet, or skald, had to instantly compose these intricate verses while adhering to incredibly strict mathematical rules of language.
On the fly.
Yes, and a great poet was as revered and often as highly rewarded with silver as a great warlord.
That is incredible. And then you look at their visual arts. The wood carvings found on the Oseberg ship or their intricate silver metalwork, these were master craftsmen producing art of astonishing beauty and geometric complexity.
Absolutely stunning work.
But the ultimate proof of their intellectual sophistication lies in their legal structure. They were not a lawless rabble, ruled purely by the strongest man with the biggest axe. They possessed a highly complex, fiercely debated legal system centered around an assembly called the Thing.
The Thing is a foundational concept in Norse society. It was essentially an early parliamentary assembly, and a court of law.
So everyone just gathered together.
Free men in this society would gather at a designated location, often an open field or a prominent rock outcropping, to debate communal issues, pass new laws, and most importantly, settle disputes through legal argumentation and mediation rather than immediate bloodshed.
It is important to note, of course, that this wasn't a modern egalitarian democracy.
Right, yeah.
The society heavily relied on enslaved people, known as thralls, who had no voice at the thing. But for the free population, it was a highly structured legal arena.
It was. They had appointed officials called law speakers Lögsögumahar in Icelandic. Because this was largely an oral culture before the widespread use of the Latin alphabet, the law speaker had to memorize the entire massive legal code of the society and recite it from memory at the assembly.
Just memorize the whole.
Every single law. And if a man killed another man, the society didn't just devolve into endless chaotic blood feuds. They had strict systems of compensation, known as Were, where a precise monetary value was assigned to the injury or death, which had to be paid to the victim's family to restore social balance.
So we are presented with this profound cognitive dissonance. We have a society that values the strict meter of complex poetry, crafts incredibly delicate jewelry, bathes regularly, and spends weeks debating the nuances of compensation law in a parliamentary assembly. And yet, they are still unapologetically, brutally violent when they row those ships onto a foreign beach.
It seems like a contradiction to us.
Right. How do we reconcile the poet and the raider?
You have to understand that in their worldview, violence and sophistication were not mutually exclusive. They were entirely complementary.
Complementary.
Yes, the violence they perpetrated on raids was not mindless, psychotic rage. It was highly organized, strategic violence employed by a sophisticated society to achieve specific goals of wealth and status back home. They did not view raiding as a savage act. They viewed it as a highly legitimate, albeit dangerous, mechanism for social advancement and economic survival.
To truly grasp that survival mindset, we have to pull the camera back from the raiding ships and the battlefields entirely. We have to look at the center of their universe. We have to step inside the longhouse.
Yes, the architecture and the atmosphere of the longhouse dictate the entire rhythm of the Norse worldview. A typical high-status longhouse was a massive structure. We're talking about a building that could easily be 30 to 40 meters long.
Over 100 feet long. That's the size of a modern gymnasium.
Easily. The walls were typically constructed of thick, upright timber logs or interwoven wattle and daub.
What about places with no trees?
Great point. In places like Iceland or Greenland, where large timber was scarce, they built massive walls out of thick blocks of earth and turf to insulate against the biting cold. But the defining feature of the longhouse is the interior layout. There are no separate private rooms.
No bedrooms.
There are no individual bedrooms or hallways. It is one massive, continuous open space, dominated by a long, central hearth fire running straight down the middle of the dirt floor.
And that fire is the absolute lifeblood of the building. It provides the only heat, the only light during the long, dark winters, and it is the sole source of cooking.
And because the hearth was open, the atmosphere inside was intense.
I can imagine.
It was incredibly smoky. The smoke from the fire would simply rise and drift out of small ventilation holes in the high roof. The interior would constantly smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, drying fish, and unwashed wool.
Yeah.
And it was loud.
Everyone in one room.
You are looking at an entire extended community living under one roof. You have the patriarch and his wife, their children, perhaps grandparents, extended relatives, farm hands, and the enslaved thralls, all sharing, working, and sleeping in this exact same space.
It is the ultimate communal living situation, and the sensory experience gets even more extreme in the deep winter because they didn't leave their valuable livestock outside to freeze.
They couldn't afford to. In the winter, they would bring the vital livestock, the cows, the sheep, the pigs, directly inside the longhouse, keeping them cordoned off at one end of the building.
You are living inside, eating, sleeping, and socializing, sharing the same air with a herd of cattle.
It sounds chaotic and deeply unsanitary to modern sensibilities, but it was a brilliant, necessary survival mechanism. The ambient body heat generated by dozens of large animals was trapped inside the thick turf walls, and it significantly raised the internal temperature of the building.
Just keeping everyone from freezing to death during a brutal January blizzard.
Exactly. The longhouse was a highly engineered, self-contained survival capsule.
And the rhythm required to keep that capsule functioning was relentless. The agricultural reality they faced was unforgiving. The Norse homelands have incredibly short, intense summer growing seasons, followed by long, dark, punishing winters.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, there was absolutely no margin for error in their agrarian cycle.
None at all.
If you didn't plant the barley fast enough in the spring, if you didn't harvest the hay fast enough to feed the cows, or if you failed to slaughter and salt enough meat in the autumn, your entire household would literally starve to death by February.
So everyone had to work.
This reality demanded constant, back-breaking labor from every single person in the community. Everyone from the chieftain down to the youngest child had a vital role to play simply to keep the farm solvent.
Which brings us to an incredibly critical and surprisingly progressive aspect of Norse culture. Because the work was so demanding and because the men were frequently absent for months at a time, whether they were away fishing, trading in Russia, or raiding in France, Norse women were required to hold remarkable levels of authority.
This is a point that fundamentally separates Norse culture from its contemporaries.
Right.
If you look at the broader picture of medieval Europe, Norse women possessed legal rights, social status, and domestic authority that women in Christian Europe at the exact same time could barely fathom.
The women essentially managed the entire agricultural and economic engine of the farm. When the husband sailed away in May, the wife didn't just sit around waiting. She was the absolute master of the estate.
She managed the planting, she directed the labor of the thralls, and most importantly, she controlled the resources.
Which was everything.
She managed the food stores, which, as we established, was literally the difference between life and death for the entire community. And this absolute domestic authority was symbolized in a highly visible, physical way.
The keys?
Yes. A high-status Norse woman, the lady of the house, would carry the physical keys to the farm's storerooms and locked wooden chests suspended from her belt.
So the keys weren't just practical tools, they were a profound symbol of status.
They were the ultimate symbol of her unchallengeable authority over the estate's wealth and survival. If she held the keys, she held the fate of the family. And their legal rights extended far beyond domestic management.
They could own property, right?
Norse women could own property in their own name.
Huh?
They could inherit land and wealth. And, incredibly for the era, they had the legal right to initiate a divorce.
The divorce laws detailed in the sagas and legal codes are fascinating. If a woman was mistreated, if her husband failed to provide for the family, or even in some recorded instances, if he habitually wore clothing deemed inappropriately effeminate, she could legally declare herself divorced.
Just in front of witnesses, right there.
Yeah. She could leave the marriage and reclaim her original dowry to support herself.
By the standards of the 8th and 9th centuries, that level of legal autonomy, economic control, and social power for women is truly exceptional.
It really is.
It demonstrates once again that this was a highly nuanced society, deeply focused on practical survival, merit, and the efficient management of resources regardless of gender.
So we have painted the physical reality. We see the smoke of the longhouse, the desperate struggle against the winter, the shared labor, the complex laws. But we have to dig one layer deeper to answer the final question.
The underlying motivation.
Yes, what actually motivated the internal mind of a Norseman? Beyond just avoiding starvation, what was the spiritual or philosophical core that drove them to push their ships into the freezing Atlantic or stand shoulder to shoulder in a shield wall in a foreign land?
We have to move from the physical economy to the philosophical economy.
Wow.
And in the Norse worldview, the ultimate transcendent currency was not silver, and it was not land.
What was it?
It was honor, and specifically it was reputation. In Norse society, your orstur, your reputation, the word of your deeds, was quite literally everything.
So it wasn't just about accumulating wealth so you could retire comfortably. The silver from a raid was only valuable because it proved your success, right?
Exactly. It was a physical manifestation of your bravery. They were obsessed with a narrative that would outlive them.
To understand this, we have to look at their most important philosophical text, the Havamal. The title translates roughly to the Sayings of the High One, referring to the god Odin. It is essentially a collection of Norse philosophy, practical wisdom, and ethical guidelines.
And there's one specific stanza in the Havamal that I think perfectly encapsulates their entire psychological state.
It is chilling in its pragmatism. It reads, "Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die, but one thing never dies, and that is the reputation of a dead man."
That single verse is the absolute skeleton key to unlocking the Viking Age. You have to put yourself in their mindset. They lived in a harsh, deeply unpredictable world where death was a constant, hovering presence.
Whether from a sudden winter famine, a storm swallowing a ship at sea, or a spear thrust in battle.
Right, and their underlying mythology of Ragnarok explicitly states that even the gods themselves are doomed to die in a final apocalyptic battle.
It is a deeply fatalistic worldview. The Norns, the fates, have already spun the thread of your life. You cannot change when you are going to die.
Exactly. They accepted that physical death was inescapable, but they believed that true death, absolute oblivion, only occurred when the last person stopped telling your story.
Wow.
If you died bravely, if your deeds were spectacular enough, the poets would weave your name into a saga. And as long as men sat around the hearth fire in the longhouse singing that saga, you were still alive. The only immortality available to them was memory.
That desire for a fame that does not die was the true psychological engine pushing those long ships across the water. You know, when you watch a modern show or read a novel and you hear the characters constantly talking about wanting their names to be sung in the halls of Valhalla or wanting to be remembered by the gods.
We tend to brush that off as dramatic writing. We assume it's just theatrical dialogue meant to sound cool.
But it isn't theatricality at all. That obsession with legacy, that absolute terror of being forgotten, is the most historically authentic aspect of those narratives.
When a Norse raider steps off his ship onto the beach at Lindisfarne, he isn't just looking for a silver cup to buy more barley. He is desperately searching for an act of daring, an act of courage, or an act of spectacular violence that will force the skalds to write a poem about him.
He is quite literally trying to buy his way into eternity with his reputation.
Exactly.
It is a staggering, beautiful, and terrifying way to view existence. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to take you back to the beginning. Let's rewatch that very first scene we started with, the cold open. We were standing on the gray beach at Lindisfarne in the year 783. The monks look up, the serpent prows cut through the surf.
But looking at it now, you don't see faceless alien monsters acting out of mindless malice.
Not at all. You see them for who they actually are. You see a crew of landless second and third sons driven off their farms by the intense, crushing economic pressure of inheritance laws at home.
You see men wielding the absolute cutting-edge, clinker-built maritime technology of their era, trusting their lives to the flexibility of those thin oak planks.
You see men who are fastidiously groomed, who carried carved bone combs and probably washed their hair just days before the raid began.
You see men who operate under a highly sophisticated, rigorously debated legal system back in Scandinavia.
You see men who left behind vast agrarian estates managed entirely by their wives, women who hold the iron keys to the wealth these men are about to steal.
And above all, you see men who, staring down their own inevitable mortality, are driven by a desperate, profound cultural need to forge an undying reputation.
They aren't attacking the monastery because they are mad. They are attacking it because it is an unguarded repository of wealth that will elevate their status, enrich their chieftains, and secure their name in the sagas for 1,000 years.
It completely reframes the entire era. The tragedy for the monks of Lindisfarne was absolute and terrible, but from the Norse perspective, that raid was a triumph of ambition, technological engineering, and philosophical purpose, all aligning at the exact right moment in history.
And that leads to the ultimate irony regarding their legacy. We constantly talk about the Viking Age ending. We talk about 1066 at Stamford Bridge, and we talk about the Norse eventually settling down, converting, and being absorbed by Christian Europe.
But they didn't really lose. And they certainly didn't vanish.
No, they didn't vanish at all. The irony is that their culture was so incredibly vital, their technology so superior, and their expansion so massive that they invisibly wove themselves into the very genetic and cultural fabric of the world they raided.
Their bloodlines, their concepts of trial by jury, their maritime vocabulary, and their place names are permanently etched into the foundations of modern England, France, Ireland, Russia, and beyond.
We started this deep dive with a mission to figure out who these people actually were. We've stripped away the Wagnerian horned helmets, the myth of the filthy barbarian, and the one-dimensional pop culture tropes.
We found brilliant navigators, complex parliamentarians, fastidious groomers, and fame-obsessed poets.
We found an incredibly resilient, intellectually complex human culture that navigated one of the harshest environments on Earth. But I want to leave you with one final lingering question to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
The ultimate question.
A thought that builds on everything we've unpacked about their psychology. We established that the absolute, undeniable core of Norse philosophy, the truth enshrined in the Havamal, was the belief that true immortality is only achieved if your reputation and your name live on in the stories of the living long after you die.
The reputation of a dead man is the only thing that never perishes. That was the ultimate prize.
So think about this. Here we are, sitting here over 1,000 years after the last serpent-prowed longship sailed. We are still making hit multi-season television shows about them. We are still writing mountains of historical analysis detailing their culture. And we are here right now dedicating this entire deep dive to dissecting their maritime engineering, their laws, and their beliefs.
Still talking about them.
If the only immortality they believed in was being remembered, didn't they actually win? Didn't those men stepping onto the beach at Lindisfarne achieve the exact undying immortality they set sail to find?